I'm so honored and blessed to be here with you on Earth Day. I'm so happy that we can celebrate Earth Day together. And to find new ways to celebrate it, I think it was perfect that the choir sang about interconnectedness. That's exactly what I'm here to speak to you about today. As Chris mentioned, I've worked with a lot of people's movements and social movements on the ground. And I've been increasingly thinking a lot about what it really means to defend our land and what it really means to be engaged global citizens in this time of what many call a planetary crisis, the climate crisis, what that means on multiple levels. So I'm going to start off on a sad note, and I promise it won't end that way. So about a month ago, just over a month ago, in a small town in Honduras, a well-known indigenous activist called Berta Cáceres was assassinated in her home. Berta had been a tireless defender of land and life for decades. She led a really strong people's resistance movement against really harmful big projects like hydroelectric dams that were set to colonize indigenous land and set to displace a lot of people from their homes and villages. She sparked movements across the world. She inspired other activists across the world. When she was assassinated, it created a global wave of sadness and of mourning. And in the last year alone, 116 land defenders, and that term is usually referring to an indigenous activist, but it can refer to all kinds of activists as well. 116 land defenders have been hurt or assassinated in the name of their work by the oppositional forces. A recent United Nations envoy called this a rising epidemic. The killing of land defenders, the targeting of people who are really so connected to the land that they protect it as if it was their own child. And in this time of critical importance for the earth, of critical importance for the climate, what does this mean that we're seeing this rising wave of opposing forces? The forces of profit and the forces of greed, opposing the forces of those who are aligned with the land and who identify with the land. And what does it mean for us as non-Indigenous people, largely? The climate change scenario that we find ourselves in, I find to be metaphorical, symbolic, something of myth and something of symbology. What the climate crisis is telling us is that we can no longer continue to exist, that the way we are. We can no longer continue the same relationship to the earth and the same relationship to one another. Climate change, to me, is the language of the earth. The earth is speaking to us in the language of natural disasters and of slow onset disasters and of fires and floods and all the impacts of climate change. It's telling us that something's not right in our global patterns and in our patterns of daily consumption and daily participation in our economies and our communities. So someone like Berta Cáceres represents something very, very different. She represents a whole other worldview. She has a beautiful quote. She says, "At the time, the most critical time of our fight against the dam, I went down to the river. I spoke to the river, and the river spoke to me. And the river told me that we will triumph. I heard it very clearly, and because the river told me, I know that we will triumph. The river told me so." Another story. I was in Venezuela last year, working with people's movements against climate change, and I spoke with an indigenous shaman who was fighting resource extraction projects in the Amazon, in the rainforest, where he had spent all his life and his people had existed for thousands of years. And he was talking about how they were opposing the government when the government was trying to extract these precious minerals and other essential resources from their forest and destroying the forest in the process. And he said to me something really interesting. He said, "When you kill the forest, you kill the people." And it's taken me almost a year to decipher that. because intuitively, it doesn't really make sense. Why do you kill, if you kill the trees and the ecosystem, why does that mean you're affecting the people? Can't the people just move around? Can't the people adapt? Why is it that when you kill the forest, you kill the people? Now, fast forward to Canada, just in the last couple of weeks, we've heard stories of First Nations communities, most recently the Attawapiskat community, which has declared a state of emergency because of increasing rates of suicide in their communities, especially suicide amongst their youth. And a really insightful journalist wrote an article about this, and the headline of the article was, "Want to stop suicide in Native communities? Step 1, stop destroying native land." Once again, we see the link between land and life. Destroying land, destroying life. If you actually speak to Native people, and this goes for Indigenous people the world over, there's a quality of connection that I find it very hard to express in English. But I guess the easiest way to say it would be, they're so deeply connected to the land that they identify it with it, the way that they identify with their bodies. And I think that's a concept that's been largely lost to our Western communities. It's been lost over time, but it still holds strong and it still holds true in many Indigenous communities the world over. And it's a piece of wisdom that we need to listen to. And I think it's the essential piece of wisdom that climate change carries within it, the imperative for us to learn. How do we recover our connection to the land in the way that physical land is an extension of our bodies? The studies show that when you do destroy native land, when you build dams, when you displace people, when you flood the land, or when you log the land, or when you change the ecosystem from how it has existed for thousands of years, the people who have lived on that land for thousands of years also begin to suffer in deep and intangible ways that show up in very tangible ways, like increasing suicide rates. If you speak to a Native person, they will tell you, when you destroy the land, you destroy our sense of identity. You destroy our sense of belonging. You destroy our sense of humanity, of being as human beings. And I think that's something that we really need to start to grasp. And I know that I'm still grappling with it myself. Joanna Macy, an eco-philosopher and a beautiful thinker, and a study of Buddhism as well, speaks about this notion of widening circles of self. To me, this notion of widening circles of self encapsulates the lesson that we're being asked to learn in the face of the climate crisis. She speaks of expanding your circle of belonging. So we have a circle of belonging that for many of us means different things, and it can mean different things even throughout your day. So your innermost circle is yourself, the individual. Then there's perhaps your family. Then there's your wider community. Then there's your nation. Maybe you feel a sense of identity with your nation. Then there's the world. But very few of us operate in that widest circle of belonging on a daily basis, or for even the majority of our day. For most of us, for most of the day, it's just us and maybe our closest and dearest loved ones. And Joanna and other thinkers have spoken on this concept as well. When you other someone, when you other them, or when you see them as something separate from yourself, as not of your flesh and blood, you're able to dominate them, you're able to oppress them, and you're able to do things to them that you wouldn't do to your own body. And this has happened on a global scale with colonialism and now with climate change, but it also happens on an interpersonal level. If we discover the key to widen the circle of self, if we discover the way to expand our circle of belonging, then the person that you see before you is not separate from you. They are you. They are one and the same. They are of your flesh, and therefore you cannot dominate, you cannot oppress, you cannot do to them what you wouldn't do to your own body, to your own loved ones, to your own innermost circle. Now this concept also applies to the land. This is the core piece of Indigenous wisdom that Indigenous land defenders the world over apply in their activism. Their circle of belonging includes every leaf, every stone, every animal, and every feature of the natural ecosystem around them. So when Berta Cáceres defends the land, she's not defending something out of a sense of it being separate from her. She's defending it the way a mother would defend her child, a sense of protectiveness that just flows effortlessly. It's not even something you think about. And that's what climate change is telling us that we need to do, and we need to learn as a society if we are to move out of the crisis. We won't solve the crisis with the same thinking that caused it. So where do we find our place within this? Where do we find our place as engaged citizens, as inhabitants of this planet Earth? How do we expand our circle of belonging? We are largely, in a great sense, we are largely displaced people. We haven't lived on this land, on this patch of earth for thousands and thousands of years as the indigenous people of this land have. So how do we establish that deep connection that will enable us to act in this era of climate change in the way that indigenous people find it so effortless to act? The first step, I would say, is to connect to the land, is to go out and find your place on it and establish the sense within yourself that you are, yes, a visitor here. We are visitors on the land of the Coast Salish people, but we are also living here. We are also residents of this land, and we are also stewards of this land. The environmental movement at large, sadly, I would say, in the last few decades, has presented us with a course of action that is largely individualized. The thing we're told to do the most when we're presented with the ecological crisis is to take individual actions in our lives. Greening our immediate home, changing our light bulbs, driving less, maybe changing up our car for an electric one. And there's nothing wrong with those actions. Those are very beautiful actions, but how are we supposed to identify in a larger sense with the crisis that has beset our Earth if we're only told that we can act in individual ways? Objectively, even if all of us acted individually, even if many of us, millions of us did, objectively, it still wouldn't be enough to stop the climate crisis as we know it. What the science tells us is that we need action on a much larger scale, in a totally different way, to actually affect change. And I think that the notion of individual action or individual responsibility has placed a large burden of guilt upon us as the individual. We feel that we need to change our lifestyles or change our habits or use our dollar differently out of a sense of obligation or a sense of responsibility. But what if we could change the definition of self so that it is no longer out of a sense of responsibility or sacrifice or even altruism, but rather out of a sense of oneness? The philosopher Marilyn Brewer said, "When the definition of self changes, the meaning of self-interest and self-serving motivations changes accordingly." And I love that quote, because when the definition of self changes, in other words, when we widen our circle of belonging to include every rock, every pebble, and every living soul around us, the meaning of self-interest changes. Self-interest means you defend the land. Self-interest means you defend everyone around you. Self-interest means you think about those who you have never met, but whose lives you are intrinsically connected to. You think of Berta Cáceres, a land defender, and we understand inherently that this metaphor, this myth, climate change that's happening to us on a global level requires us all to be land defenders. In small ways in our individual lives, but also on a soul level, at the source where we are able to widen our circle of belonging, to ripple out into the world so that everybody in this earth is included in that circle. So climate change, to me, is a direct challenge for us to do this very difficult inner work, primarily, so that we can come together to act. And those two steps are inseparable to me, the inner work and the acting together, acting collectively, acting as communities and as groups of people and as families. And that's the imperative that I see in our world today. And that's the great lesson that Indigenous people and Indigenous wisdom have for us. So this Earth Day for me is about celebrating and honoring land defenders the world over, and the wisdom that land defenders hold for each of us. And my prayer is that as our ecological act of love on this Earth Day, as our act of love to those around us and to the earth, we begin to do that inner work and we begin to understand what it means to widen the circle of our sense of self. Thank you so much for having me today.